The candlelight flickered across her face as we moved through the steps of the pavane, and I found myself wondering how I had lived 26 years without knowing that such grace could exist in this world. Her hand rested lightly in mine, warm despite the autumn chill that had settled over the castle, and for the first time in months of tedious court attendance, I felt truly present in the moment. My name is Nathaniel Ashford, second son of a minor noble family from the northern counties, and I had come to court with all the enthusiasm of a man attending his own execution. My father had insisted, of course, claiming it was time I made advantageous connections and perhaps found myself a wife with a substantial dowry. The very thought had filled me with dread, knowing full well that court was a den of scheming and superficiality where genuine feeling was as rare as an honest politician. But here I was, dancing with a young woman whose very presence seemed to transform the garish splendor of the great hall into something almost magical. She couldn't have been more than 22, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper and eyes the color of winter storms. There was something in her expression, a depth of understanding that suggested she saw through the pageantry as clearly as I did. When I had first spotted her across the crowded hall, she had been standing apart from the other courtiers, observing the festivities with what appeared to be quiet amusement rather than participation. While other ladies giggled behind their fans and competed for the attention of wealthy lords, she had seemed content to watch, as if she were studying some fascinating but slightly absurd theatrical performance. I had approached her impulsively, something entirely unlike my usual cautious nature. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, with a dignity that seemed both natural and hard-won, or perhaps it was simply that she looked as reluctant to be there as I felt. Either way, I found myself crossing the hall before I had fully decided to do so. "You seem as enchanted by these proceedings as I am," I had said by way of introduction, gesturing toward a group of courtiers who were loudly debating the merits of their hunting hounds while ignoring the musicians entirely. She had turned to look at me then, and I was struck by the intelligence in her gaze. Most court ladies had perfected the art of looking both alluring and empty-headed, but this woman's eyes held secrets and stories that I suddenly wanted very much to hear. "Enchanted is certainly one word for it," she had replied, and there was the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Though I might choose a different adjective entirely." "And what adjective would that be?" "Illuminating," she had said after a moment's consideration. "There's something quite revealing about watching people when they believe themselves to be at their most impressive." I had laughed then, genuinely and freely, something I hadn't done since arriving at court 3 weeks prior. "And what has tonight's illumination revealed to you?" "That Lord Pemberton over there has been drinking far more than is wise, that Lady Catherine is desperately trying to catch the eye of the Earl of Sussex, and that you, sir, are either very brave or very foolish to be speaking with me." Before I could ask what she meant by that curious statement, the musicians had begun a new tune, and I had found myself asking her to dance. She had hesitated for just a moment, her eyes searching my face as if trying to determine whether I truly understood what I was requesting. Then she had placed her hand in mine, and we had stepped onto the floor. Now, as we moved through the intricate steps, I found myself studying her face in the golden light. There was a small scar just above her left eyebrow, barely visible unless one looked closely, but rather than detracting from her beauty, it somehow enhanced it, giving her face character that the unmarked perfection of other court ladies lacked. When I complimented her on her dancing, she had smiled with genuine pleasure rather than the practiced coquettishness I had grown accustomed to. "I've had excellent instruction," she had said, her voice carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. "Though I fear I have fewer opportunities to practice than most ladies of the court." "And why is that?" I had asked, spinning her gracefully as the music demanded. "Let us simply say that not all ladies are equally welcome at every gathering," she had replied, and there was that mysterious sadness in her eyes again. I was about to press her for more details when I became aware that we were attracting attention. Several courtiers had stopped their own conversations to watch us, and I could see them whispering behind their hands. At first, I assumed they were simply noting that a relatively unknown minor lord was dancing with such an attractive partner, but there was something in their expressions that suggested the matter was more complicated than simple social curiosity. An elderly lord whom I recognized as Sir Geoffrey Whitmore was frowning in our direction with obvious disapproval, while his wife was making sharp gestures that clearly indicated she thought our dance was somehow inappropriate. Even more puzzling, several of the younger courtiers seemed to be watching with a mixture of fascination and something that looked almost like fear. "We appear to be providing entertainment beyond the dancing," I observed quietly, nodding slightly toward our audience. My partner followed my gaze and sighed softly. "I did warn you that speaking with me might be either brave or foolish. I'm afraid the jury is still out on which it proves to be." I find myself curious about what terrible crime you could possibly have committed to warrant such attention, I said, attempting to keep my tone light despite my growing confusion. Did you perhaps criticize someone's embroidery? Suggest that a particular hairstyle was unflattering? She laughed then, a sound both lovely and tinged with resignation. Nothing quite so scandalous, I'm afraid. Sometimes one's very existence is crime enough in the eyes of polite society. Before I could ask her to explain this cryptic statement, the dance came to an end, and we found ourselves standing face to face in the center of the hall. The whispers around us had grown more pronounced, and I could see several matrons shaking their heads in what appeared to be stern disapproval. Whatever social boundary I had unknowingly crossed by dancing with this remarkable woman, it was clearly a significant one. Perhaps, she said quietly, her eyes never leaving mine, we should continue this conversation somewhere with fewer observers. The gardens, despite the autumn chill, might provide a more comfortable setting for explanations. I nodded eagerly, offering her my arm. As we made our way toward the doors that led to the castle's extensive grounds, I caught sight of a tall man with calculating eyes who was watching our progress with particular intensity. There was something in his expression that made me distinctly uncomfortable, a predatory quality that seemed entirely at odds with the elegant court attire he wore. The cool evening air was a relief after the stifling warmth of the crowded hall, and I found myself breathing more easily as we stepped onto the gravel path that wound between carefully manicured hedges. The autumn had painted the leaves in brilliant golds and crimsons, and they crunched softly beneath our feet as we walked. Now then, I said, once we were safely away from the curious eyes and sharp ears of the court, perhaps you'll tell me exactly what sort of social transgression I've committed by having the pleasure of your company this evening. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested the answer was more complicated than I could possibly imagine. What do you know, she asked carefully, about the nature of legitimacy, Mr. Ashford? Her question hung in the crisp autumn air between us like a challenge, and I found myself studying her face more carefully in the moonlight that filtered through the bare branches above us. There was something in the way she had posed it, a careful deliberation that suggested my answer would determine how much of her story she was willing to share. I know that legitimacy is often a matter of circumstance rather than choice, I replied slowly, choosing my words with care. And that society tends to judge harshly those who had no say in the circumstances of their birth. She nodded approvingly, as if I had passed some sort of test. You speak with more wisdom than most men of your station, Mr. Ashford. Most would have given me a lecture about moral propriety and divine order. Most men of my station haven't spent years watching their elder brothers inherit everything while being reminded daily that accident of birth order determines one's entire destiny, I said with perhaps more bitterness than I intended. It tends to make one somewhat less convinced of the inherent fairness of our social hierarchy. A genuine smile crossed her face then, the first truly unguarded expression I had seen from her. Then perhaps you will understand when I tell you that my name is Cordelia Blackthorne, and that I am what polite society terms a natural daughter. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, though I tried not to let my shock show on my face. A natural daughter meant she was born outside wedlock, acknowledged but forever marked by the circumstances of her birth. It explained the whispers, the disapproving glances, the careful distance other courtiers maintained from her. In our rigidly hierarchical world, such children occupied a peculiar limbo, neither fully accepted nor entirely cast out. And your father? I asked gently, though something in her expression suggested I might already know the answer. Is a man whose acknowledgement of my existence has been both blessing and curse, she said quietly. He has ensured I received an education far beyond what most women might expect, has seen that I want for nothing material, and has even granted me a place at court when it suits his purposes. But he has also made it clear that there are certain expectations and limitations that will forever govern my life. I was beginning to suspect the identity of this complicated father, but before I could voice my thoughts, she continued speaking, her voice taking on a tone of resigned acceptance that suggested years of navigating impossible social waters. I have been taught languages and literature, history and mathematics, music and dancing, all the accomplishments of a lady of high birth. Yet I am reminded daily that these accomplishments exist primarily for my own amusement, as no respectable family would consider an alliance with someone of my irregular status. We had reached a small alcove in the garden where a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches created a natural canopy above us. She settled herself gracefully on the bench, arranging her skirts with the unconscious elegance of someone trained from childhood in proper deportment. You speak of these limitations with remarkable equanimity, I observed, taking a seat beside her at what I hoped was a respectful distance. Many would be bitter about such circumstances. Bitterness serves no useful purpose, she replied, though I caught a flash of something darker in her eyes. I learned long ago that raging against the circumstances of one's birth is like shouting at the rain to stop falling. One must find ways to work within the constraints of reality. And yet you attend court functions, you dance, you engage in conversation with minor lords who clearly don't understand the full implications of their actions, I said with a self-deprecating smile. That suggests someone who refuses to be entirely constrained by society's expectations. She laughed softly, but there was little humor in the sound. I attend because my presence is occasionally required, because my father wishes me to maintain certain appearances. As for dancing with you, well, you seem genuinely pleasant, and it has been some time since I encountered genuine pleasantness at one of these gatherings. I'm honored by the distinction, I said, and meant it. Though I confess I'm curious about what makes such occasions particularly trying for you. Her expression grew more serious, and she was quiet for a moment, as if debating how much truth she was willing to share. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of years of careful observation and hard-won understanding. Imagine, if you will, being invited to a feast where you are permitted to see and smell all the most delicious dishes, but where everyone understands that you are not truly meant to partake of them. You may sit at the table, you may make pleasant conversation, you may even be complimented on your appearance or your wit, but you must never forget that you are fundamentally different from the other guests. The analogy was both elegant and heartbreaking, and I found myself feeling a surge of anger on her behalf. That sounds like a particularly cruel form of torture. It can be, she admitted. Especially when one is young and still harbors foolish hopes that perhaps the rules might bend, that someone might see past the circumstances of birth to the person beneath. Age brings wisdom, however, and I have learned to find satisfaction in smaller pleasures. Such as books, primarily. They judge neither birth nor status, only one's willingness to engage with ideas. Music, though I play only for my own enjoyment. Gardens like this one, where the flowers bloom or fail based on soil and weather rather than bloodline. She gestured toward the carefully tended beds that surrounded us, where late autumn roses still clung to their stems despite the approaching winter. I found myself studying her profile as she spoke, noting the way the moonlight caught the auburn highlights in her hair and the graceful line of her neck. There was something about her combination of intelligence, resignation, and underlying strength that was utterly captivating. I had expected this evening to be another tedious exercise in social obligation, but instead I found myself in the company of someone whose conversation was more engaging than any I had experienced in months. You mentioned that your father ensured you received an extensive education, I said. What subjects have captured your particular interest? Her face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, and I realized this was perhaps the first time all evening that someone had asked about her interests rather than her circumstances. History fascinates me endlessly, she said, her voice taking on an animated quality that made her even more attractive than before. Particularly the stories of women who found ways to exercise influence despite the constraints of their times. There's something inspiring about learning how others navigated seemingly impossible situations. Any particular figures who have captured your imagination? Eleanor of Aquitaine, certainly. A woman who managed to be queen of 2 different kingdoms and mother to kings, despite living in an age when women were expected to be decorative and silent. And I find myself drawn to the stories of women who patronized scholars and artists, who created spaces where learning could flourish even when they themselves were denied formal recognition. I was struck by the passion in her voice, the clear evidence of a mind that had been given excellent material to work with and had made the most of every opportunity. It occurred to me that many of the young ladies I had met at court could discuss fashion and gossip with great expertise, but few could speak with such insight about historical figures or political movements. I suspect you know more about statecraft than half the men in that hall, I said with genuine admiration. Perhaps, she replied with a slight smile, but knowing and being permitted to act on that knowledge are entirely different matters. As if summoned by her words, we heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path, and both of us turned to see a figure approaching through the shadows. Even before he stepped into the moonlight, something about his bearing struck me as familiar, and I felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Miss Blackthorne," came a voice that carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "how delightful to find you taking the evening air. And with such charming company." The man who emerged from the shadows was perhaps 35, impeccably dressed in court finery that spoke of both wealth and position. His dark hair was perfectly arranged, his beard trimmed with mathematical precision, and his smile held all the warmth of a winter morning. This was clearly the same man I had noticed watching us in the hall, and something about his presence made me instinctively want to step protectively closer to Cordelia. Sir Roderick, she replied with carefully neutral politeness, rising from the bench with fluid grace. I trust you are enjoying the evening's festivities. Indeed I am, he said, his calculating gaze moving between us with obvious assessment. Though I confess I was somewhat surprised to see you dancing with our young friend here. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. His tone suggested that this lack of introduction was a serious social oversight rather than a simple coincidence, and I felt compelled to remedy the situation despite my growing dislike of the man. Nathaniel Ashford, I said, offering a bow that was precisely as deep as courtesy demanded and not a fraction more. Of the Ashfords of Whitmore. Ah yes, Sir Roderick said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, young Ashford. I knew your elder brother at court some years ago. Fine family, excellent reputation. I'm sure your parents would be delighted to know you're making such interesting connections during your time here. The emphasis he placed on the word interesting carried implications that made my jaw clench, but before I could respond, Cordelia stepped forward with the sort of calm dignity that somehow made Sir Roderick's veiled insult seem petty and crude by comparison. How thoughtful of you to be concerned about Mr. Ashford's family, Sir Roderick, Cordelia said with a smile that was perfectly polite and utterly without warmth. I'm certain they raised him to be capable of making his own judgments about appropriate company. The subtle rebuke hung in the air between them like a blade, and I watched Sir Roderick's expression shift almost imperceptibly. His smile remained fixed in place, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind his eyes, and I realized that I was witnessing a battle of wills between two people who understood the rules of courtly warfare far better than I did. Of course, Sir Roderick replied smoothly, though one does feel a certain responsibility to guide younger members of society when they might be venturing into waters whose depths they haven't fully measured. The threat in his words was becoming more explicit, and I felt my temper beginning to rise. Who was this pompous peacock to suggest that I couldn't judge for myself what company I chose to keep? Before I could say something that might cause irreparable damage to my family's standing, however, Cordelia placed a gentle hand on my arm. Perhaps we should return to the hall, she said quietly. The evening grows chill, and I suspect the musicians are preparing for the final dances. I wanted to argue, wanted to stay in the garden and force Sir Roderick to explain exactly what he thought gave him the right to issue veiled warnings about my choice of companions. But something in Cordelia's touch, a subtle pressure that seemed to communicate both warning and plea, made me reconsider. Of course, I said, offering her my arm with deliberate courtesy. The pleasure of your conversation has made me forget how late the hour has grown. We walked back toward the castle in relative silence, Sir Roderick falling into step beside us with the persistence of a man who clearly believed his presence was not only welcome but necessary. The lights from the great hall spilled out through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of golden warmth across the frost-touched grass, and I could hear the sound of laughter and music drifting on the night air. Once we had returned to the crowded hall, Sir Roderick excused himself with elaborate politeness, but not before fixing me with a look that made his message unmistakably clear. I was being watched, and my continued association with Cordelia would not go unnoticed or unremarked upon. Pleasant fellow, I muttered under my breath as he disappeared into the crowd. Sir Roderick Pemberton is many things, Cordelia replied carefully, but pleasant has never been among them. He considers himself a guardian of social propriety, which in practice means he delights in making life difficult for anyone who doesn't fit neatly into his narrow view of how society should function. And you, I take it, don't fit neatly into his narrow view. I'm afraid I represent everything he finds most troubling about our changing times, she said with a wry smile. A woman with opinions, a person of irregular birth who refuses to be appropriately ashamed, someone who has been granted opportunities that he believes should be reserved for more deserving candidates. As if to prove her point, I noticed that our return to the hall had not gone unobserved. Several clusters of courtiers were watching us with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, and more than a few were whispering behind their hands with the sort of animated intensity that suggested our brief absence had provided ample fodder for speculation. It seems our garden conversation has become a topic of general interest, I observed, nodding toward a group of ladies who were watching us with the focused attention of hunters studying their prey. Cordelia followed my gaze and sighed softly. I did warn you that speaking with me might prove to be either brave or foolish. I'm beginning to fear it may lean toward the latter. Then perhaps, I said with more boldness than I felt, it's time for me to demonstrate just how foolishly brave I can be. Before she could ask what I meant, I had taken her hand and was leading her back onto the dance floor. The musicians were indeed playing what appeared to be one of the final sets of the evening, a slow and stately galliard that would give us ample opportunity for conversation while providing a legitimate excuse for continued proximity. If our first dance had attracted attention, our second caused something approaching a sensation. I could feel the weight of dozens of stares, could hear the sharp intake of breath from more than one direction, and could see Sir Roderick's expression of barely controlled fury from across the room. But I found that I didn't care. The woman in my arms was intelligent, graceful, and refreshingly honest, and if that scandalized the assembled worthies of Elizabeth's court, then perhaps it was time someone scandalized them. You realize, Cordelia said quietly as we moved through the intricate steps, that by dancing with me twice in one evening, you've essentially announced to everyone present that you're either courting me or making a deliberate statement about your disregard for social convention. And which do you think it is? I asked, spinning her gracefully as the music demanded. I think, she said, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken, that you're a man who makes decisions based on his own judgment rather than other people's expectations. It's a rare and admirable quality, even if it does tend to complicate one's life considerably. Speaking of complications, I said, glancing toward where Sir Roderick was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with several other men, I have the distinct impression that our friend over there is not simply a self-appointed guardian of propriety. There's something more personal in his animosity toward you. Cordelia's expression grew more guarded, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of weary resignation that suggested this was a story she had told before, though perhaps never to someone she hoped might understand. Sir Roderick has a particular interest in maintaining the traditional boundaries of our social hierarchy, she said carefully. He believes that people like me represent a dangerous precedent, that acknowledging the children of irregular unions somehow weakens the foundations of legitimate authority. And does he have sufficient influence to make his displeasure felt in practical terms? He has the ear of several powerful families, and he's not above using carefully placed words to damage reputations or create difficulties for those who displease him. He's already made it clear to several potential suitors that any man who showed serious interest in me would find his own prospects considerably diminished. The casual way she spoke of this deliberate sabotage of her life made my anger flare again, but I tried to keep my voice level as I responded. And have there been many such suitors? A few, she admitted. Men who were perhaps attracted by the novelty of my situation, or who thought that someone of my irregular status might be grateful enough for attention to overlook their own shortcomings. None who were willing to face the social consequences of actually pursuing a serious courtship. Their loss, I said firmly, and was rewarded with another of her genuine smiles. You say that now, she replied, but you haven't yet experienced the full weight of social disapproval. It can be remarkably wearing, even for those who believe themselves above such considerations. As if summoned by her words, I became aware that Sir Roderick was approaching us again, this time accompanied by an older gentleman whom I recognized as Lord Pemberton, presumably a relative of some sort. Both men wore expressions of grim determination, and I had the unpleasant feeling that whatever conversation they intended to have with us would not be conducted with the subtle courtesy that had characterized our earlier encounter. The music came to an end just as they reached us, and Lord Pemberton fixed me with a stare that could have frozen wine in summer. Young Ashford, he said without preamble, I believe your father and I served together on the Queen's Council some years ago. Fine man, your father. I'm sure he would be interested to know how you're spending your time at court. The threat was even less veiled than Sir Roderick's had been, and I felt my jaw clench as I struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make the situation worse for either Cordelia or my family. Before I could speak, however, she stepped forward with the sort of calm grace that somehow made both men look petty and small by comparison. Lord Pemberton, she said with a curtsy that was precisely correct and utterly without warmth, how good of you to take such an interest in Mr. Ashford's welfare. I'm certain his family appreciates your concern for his reputation. The emphasis she placed on the word reputation carried its own implications, and I saw Lord Pemberton's face flush with anger. Whatever game was being played here, the stakes were clearly higher than I had initially understood, and I was beginning to realize that my simple attraction to an intelligent and beautiful woman had somehow placed me at the center of a much larger conflict. Miss Blackthorne, Lord Pemberton replied with icy politeness, I trust you understand that some associations can be more costly than others, particularly for young men who are just beginning to establish themselves in society. Indeed, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, I've observed that some people are remarkably quick to judge the value of associations based on entirely superficial criteria. It's fortunate that others are capable of making more thoughtful assessments. The exchange was becoming more heated despite the careful courtesy of the language being used, and I could see that we were attracting even more attention from the surrounding courtiers. Several people had stopped their own conversations to watch our little drama unfold, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that whatever happened next would be the subject of court gossip for weeks to come. It was at that moment that a new voice cut through the tension like a blade, and every person in our immediate vicinity suddenly grew very still. "Lord Pemberton," came a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "How delightful to see you taking such an active interest in the social education of our younger courtiers." I turned to see who had spoken, and felt my breath catch in my throat as I realized that we had attracted the attention of someone whose involvement would change everything about this situation. The implications of that authoritative voice were about to become terrifyingly clear. The man who had spoken was perhaps 50 years of age, with graying hair and the sort of bearing that suggested absolute confidence in his own authority. His clothing was rich but understated, and there was something in his face that made me think of portraits I had seen of great commanders and statesmen. But it was the way everyone around us immediately bowed or curtsied that told me exactly who this was, and my blood ran cold as the full implications of the situation became clear. I was looking at the Earl of Essex, one of the Queen's most trusted advisers and a man whose favor could make careers and whose displeasure could destroy them. More importantly, as I watched Cordelia sink into a curtsy that was both respectful and somehow familiar, I realized that I was witnessing a daughter greeting her father. "Your lordship," Lord Pemberton said with a bow so deep it was almost genuflection, "I was merely expressing some concern about young Ashford's choice of companions this evening." "Were you indeed?" the Earl replied with silky smoothness that somehow managed to sound more dangerous than outright anger. "How thoughtful of you to take such an interest in the social development of the younger generation. I'm certain young Ashford appreciates your guidance." The words were perfectly polite, but there was something in the Earl's tone that made it clear he was not pleased with Lord Pemberton's interference. I felt as though I was watching a master chess player contemplate his next move, and I had the uncomfortable suspicion that I was one of the pieces on the board. "Father," Cordelia said quietly, and there was something in her voice that suggested this public acknowledgement of their relationship was both necessary and potentially costly. "Mr. Ashford has been most courteous this evening." "I'm certain he has," the Earl replied, his gaze moving to me with an intensity that made me feel as though he could see directly into my thoughts. "The Ashfords have always been known for their courtesy and good judgment. I knew your father well, young man. He served the realm with distinction." "Thank you, your lordship," I managed, my voice somehow steady despite the fact that my heart was beating so rapidly I was certain everyone could hear it. "He speaks of his service with great pride." "As well he should," the Earl said, and then, to my complete amazement, he smiled. "I trust you're finding court life educational." "Very much so, your lordship," I replied, acutely aware that my answer was being evaluated not just by him but by everyone within earshot. "I've discovered that reality is often quite different from expectation." "An excellent lesson to learn early," he said approvingly. "Too many young men arrive at court with romantic notions about honor and justice, only to discover that the world is considerably more complex than their tutors led them to believe." I was beginning to suspect that this conversation had layers of meaning that I was only beginning to grasp, but before I could formulate an appropriate response, Sir Roderick stepped forward with the sort of determination that suggested he was either very brave or very foolish. "Your lordship," he said with elaborate courtesy, "I hope you'll forgive my presumption, but I felt it was important to ensure that young Ashford understood the potential complications of certain associations." The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop several degrees, and I watched the Earl's expression shift from polite interest to something considerably more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice carried the sort of quiet authority that made it clear he was not accustomed to having his decisions questioned. "Sir Roderick," he said with deadly calm, "I appreciate your concern for the welfare of our younger courtiers. However, I'm confident that Mr. Ashford is quite capable of evaluating the merits of his own associations without assistance." The rebuke was delivered with such elegant restraint that it took a moment for its full impact to register, but when it did, Sir Roderick's face went white with either anger or fear. He had just been publicly dressed down by one of the most powerful men in England, and everyone present understood exactly what that meant for his standing at court. "Of course, your lordship," he said stiffly. "I meant no disrespect." "I'm certain you didn't," the Earl replied with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe the musicians are preparing for the final dance of the evening, and I should very much like to see my daughter dance it." The dismissal was absolute, and both Sir Roderick and Lord Pemberton had no choice but to bow and withdraw. I watched them retreat with expressions of barely contained fury, and I realized that while the Earl's intervention had protected us for the moment, it had also escalated the conflict to a level where there would be no easy resolution. "Cordelia," the Earl said, his voice taking on a warmer tone now that the immediate threat had been dealt with, "I trust you've been enjoying the evening's festivities." "Yes, father," she replied, and I could hear the relief in her voice despite her careful composure. Mr. Ashford has proven to be excellent company. I'm pleased to hear it, he said, and then turned to me with an expression that was both approving and slightly calculating. Young Ashford, I hope you'll forgive the dramatic nature of this evening's entertainment. Court life can be rather theatrical at times. I'm beginning to understand that, your lordship, I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. Though I confess I'm still learning to navigate the more subtle aspects of court politics. An honest admission, he said approvingly. Too many young men pretend to understand more than they do, which often leads to costly mistakes. Tell me, what are your impressions of my daughter? The question was so direct that it caught me completely off guard, and I found myself stammering slightly as I tried to formulate an appropriate response. How did one tell one of the most powerful men in England that his illegitimate daughter was the most fascinating woman you had ever met? I find her to be remarkably intelligent and well-educated, I said carefully. Her conversation has been both enlightening and enjoyable. High praise indeed, he said with what appeared to be genuine amusement. Cordelia has always been something of a scholar. I sometimes think she reads more than my entire council combined. I can well believe it, I said, glancing at Cordelia, who was watching this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. She speaks about historical figures with remarkable insight. She does indeed, the Earl agreed. I've often thought it a pity that women of her intelligence have so few opportunities to put their learning to practical use. Perhaps that will change as our world continues to evolve. There was something in his tone that suggested this was more than idle speculation, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something more significant than a simple social encounter. The Earl's protection of Cordelia seemed to go beyond mere paternal affection, and his pointed dismissal of Sir Roderick's objection suggested that he had his own plans for his daughter's future. Father, Cordelia said quietly, perhaps we shouldn't detain Mr. Ashford any longer. I'm certain he has other obligations this evening. On the contrary, I said quickly, before the Earl could respond, I can think of no better way to conclude the evening than with another dance, if Miss Blackthorne would be so kind as to honor me. The Earl's eyebrows rose slightly at my boldness, but there was definitely approval in his expression. An excellent suggestion, he said. Though I should warn you, young Ashford, that dancing with my daughter twice in one evening is likely to be interpreted as a declaration of serious intent by the assembled gossips. Then perhaps, I said with more courage than I knew I possessed, it's fortunate that I have no objection to such an interpretation. The words hung in the air between us like a thrown gauntlet, and I realized that I had just publicly declared my interest in pursuing a courtship with the illegitimate daughter of one of England's most powerful nobles. The implications of such a statement were staggering, and yet as I looked at Cordelia's face and saw the mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope in her eyes, I found that I didn't regret my boldness. Indeed, the Earl said softly, and there was something in his voice that suggested my words had pleased him more than I might have expected. Fortune favors the bold, as they say. Very well, young Ashford, let us see how well you dance when the entire court is watching. As if to underscore his words, I became aware that our conversation had attracted the attention of virtually everyone in the hall. The musicians were indeed preparing for what appeared to be the final set of the evening, and as couples began to take their positions on the floor, I realized that every eye would be upon us. Are you quite certain about this? Cordelia asked quietly as I offered her my hand. Once we step onto that floor, there will be no taking back what you've just declared. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, I replied, and as I said the words, I realized they were absolutely true. In the space of a single evening, this remarkable woman had managed to capture not just my attention but something deeper and more significant. Whether that was wise or foolish remained to be seen, but I found I no longer cared about the distinction. Then, she said with a smile that transformed her entire face, let us give them something worth watching. As we took our places among the other couples, I caught sight of Sir Roderick standing near the wall with Lord Pemberton and several other men, all of whom were watching us with expressions of barely contained fury. Whatever forces I had set in motion this evening, there would clearly be consequences to face in the days and weeks to come. But as the music began and Cordelia's hand settled into mine with perfect trust, I found myself thinking that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The woman beside me represented everything I had never dared to hope for in a partner: intelligence, grace, courage, and a depth of character that promised a lifetime of discovery. If you're watching this from somewhere around the world, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Leave me a comment and let me know what country you're in, and what you think about taking such a bold risk for love. The dance that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Every step seemed choreographed not just to the music but to some larger rhythm that encompassed our growing connection, the watching eyes of the court, and the sense that we were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. And as we moved together in perfect harmony, I began to understand that sometimes the most important battles in life are fought not with swords or strategies, but with the simple courage to follow one's heart despite the consequences. The days that followed that momentous evening were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Word of my public declaration had spread through the court with the speed of wildfire, and suddenly I found myself at the center of a storm of speculation, approval, and barely concealed hostility that I was woefully unprepared to navigate. Some courtiers regarded me with newfound respect, clearly interpreting my boldness as evidence of either extraordinary courage or powerful connections. Others looked upon me with thinly veiled contempt, as if I had committed some unforgivable breach of social protocol. But it was the third group that concerned me most, those who watched me with the calculating interest of people who saw opportunity in chaos. Sir Roderick, predictably, had not taken my public challenge lying down. Within 2 days of the ball, I began to notice that certain doors which had previously been open to me were now mysteriously closed. Invitations that I had expected to receive failed to materialize, and conversations that should have been routine suddenly became stilted and uncomfortable. "Your new friend seems to have considerable influence," my manservant Thomas observed as he helped me dress for what had become a daily ritual of attempting to navigate an increasingly hostile social environment. "Sir Roderick has clearly been busy," I agreed, struggling with the elaborate fastenings on my doublet. "Though I confess I'm surprised by the speed with which he's managed to mobilize opposition." "Perhaps," Thomas suggested diplomatically, "the opposition was already there, waiting for an excuse to manifest itself." His words proved more prescient than I had initially realized. Over the following week, it became clear that Sir Roderick's campaign against me was not simply a matter of personal animosity, but part of a larger effort to send a message about the consequences of challenging established social boundaries. I was being made an example of, and the lesson was intended for anyone else who might be tempted to follow my lead. The campaign took several forms, some subtle and others remarkably direct. I found myself excluded from hunting parties that I had previously been invited to join, discovered that my opinions were no longer solicited in discussions where they had once been welcome, and noticed that several young ladies who had previously been friendly now seemed to find urgent business elsewhere whenever I approached. More troubling still were the whispered conversations that I began to overhear, fragments of speculation about my family's finances, my prospects for advancement, and my fitness for the responsibilities that came with noble birth. It was clear that Sir Roderick and his allies were conducting a careful campaign to undermine my reputation and social standing. But the most painful aspect of this social persecution was the way it affected my ability to see Cordelia. While the Earl of Essex's protection ensured that no one would dare to openly forbid our association, the practical difficulties of arranging meetings became almost insurmountable. Every public encounter was scrutinized and commented upon, every private conversation was a subject for speculation, and the simple pleasure of her company became fraught with political implications. It was during this difficult period that I received an unexpected summons to meet with the Earl himself. The message was delivered by a liveried servant who gave no indication of the purpose of the meeting, and I found myself walking through the corridors of the castle with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Earl received me in his private study, a room lined with books and maps that spoke of both learning and power. He was seated behind a massive oak desk that had clearly seen decades of important correspondence, and when he looked up from the document he was reading, his expression was thoughtful rather than stern. "Young Ashford," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat in the chair opposite his desk, "I trust you've been finding court life educational during these past weeks." "Very much so, your lordship," I replied carefully. Though perhaps not in the ways I had originally anticipated. He smiled at that, an expression of genuine amusement that transformed his austere features. "I imagine not. Tell me, what have you learned from your recent experiences?" The question was clearly a test of some sort, and I found myself considering my words carefully before responding. "I've learned that challenging social conventions, however well-intentioned, can have consequences that extend far beyond one's original intentions. I've also learned that there are forces at work in court that are more complex and more ruthless than I had previously understood." "Excellent observations," he said approvingly. "And how do you feel about the personal costs of your boldness?" "I regret that my actions may have caused difficulties for your daughter," I said honestly. "But I cannot regret the sentiments that prompted those actions. Even though those sentiments have made you enemies and complicated your future prospects considerably." "Even so, your lordship." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the intensity of someone who was accustomed to reading character in others. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested the conversation was about to move in a direction I hadn't anticipated. "Cordelia has spoken to me about your conversations," he said quietly. "She tells me that you're a man of considerable intelligence and genuine feeling, someone who sees beyond the surface of things to the substance beneath." "She is too kind," I replied, though my heart leaped at the thought that she had spoken of me to her father. "She is many things," he said with a slight smile, "but kind beyond reason is not one of them. When my daughter offers praise, it is because praise has been earned." He leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "Which brings me to the real purpose of our meeting today." I waited, hardly daring to breathe, as he seemed to consider his next words carefully. "You may have wondered," he continued, "why I intervened so decisively on your behalf that evening at the ball. It was not simply paternal affection, though I confess that played a role. It was also because I have been watching you, evaluating your character and your potential, and I have reached certain conclusions about your suitability." "Suitability for what, your lordship?" "For a role that I have long believed my daughter was destined to play, despite the irregular circumstances of her birth." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the castle grounds where the last leaves of autumn were falling like golden snow. "Cordelia is not simply my natural daughter, young Ashford. She is one of the most intelligent and capable people I have ever known, regardless of gender or birth. I have spent years ensuring that she received an education equal to any man's, because I believed that someday she would have the opportunity to put that education to use. I'm not certain I understand, your lordship. I believe," he said, turning back to face me, "that the world is changing in ways that most people don't yet comprehend. The old certainties about birth and status are beginning to crumble, and those who adapt to these changes will prosper while those who cling to outdated notions will find themselves increasingly irrelevant." He moved back to his desk, his expression intense. "Cordelia represents the future, a woman of extraordinary capability who happens to have been born outside the traditional structures of legitimacy. The man who has the vision to see past those circumstances and the courage to ally himself with her will gain not just a remarkable wife, but a partner capable of helping him navigate the complexities of our changing world." The implications of his words were staggering, and I found myself struggling to process what he was suggesting. "Are you saying, your lordship, that you would approve of a formal courtship?" "I'm saying more than that," he replied with a smile that held both warmth and steel. "I'm saying that I believe you and Cordelia could build something together that would be stronger and more enduring than anything either of you could achieve alone." But, his expression grew more serious, such a partnership would require both courage and wisdom. The forces arrayed against such an alliance are formidable, and they will not hesitate to use every weapon at their disposal to prevent it. As if summoned by his words, there was a sharp knock at the study door, and before the Earl could respond, it opened to reveal Sir Roderick himself, his face flushed with barely contained anger and his manner suggesting that he had urgent business that could not wait for normal courtesy. "Your lordship," he said with a bow that was perfunctory at best, "I apologize for the intrusion, but there are matters of considerable urgency that require your immediate attention." The Earl's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness suggested that Sir Roderick's unexpected arrival was neither welcome nor coincidental. "Indeed? And what matters would those be, Sir Roderick?" "Matters concerning the reputation of this house and the welfare of all who serve it," Sir Roderick replied, his gaze moving pointedly to me. "I have reason to believe that certain associations may be placing both at risk." The challenge was now out in the open, and I realized that whatever game had been building to this moment was about to reach its climax. Sir Roderick had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer sufficient, and he was prepared to confront the Earl directly about my relationship with Cordelia. "How fascinating," the Earl said with deadly calm. "And what evidence do you have to support such a serious allegation?" Sir Roderick reached into his doublet and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, which he placed on the desk with the satisfaction of someone playing a winning card. "This correspondence, which came to my attention through channels I am not at liberty to reveal, suggests that young Ashford's family may not be as financially stable as they have led people to believe. Furthermore, there are questions about his true motivations in pursuing an association with your daughter." I felt my blood run cold as I realized what Sir Roderick was suggesting. He was impugning not just my character but my family's honor, and he was doing so in front of the one man whose opinion could determine my entire future. The document on the desk seemed to radiate menace, and I found myself wondering what fabricated evidence he had managed to construct. But before I could speak in my own defense, the Earl reached for the parchment with an expression of mild curiosity, and as he began to read, something extraordinary happened. Instead of growing angry or concerned, he began to smile, and by the time he finished reading, he was actually chuckling with what appeared to be genuine amusement. "Sir Roderick," he said, looking up from the document with eyes that sparkled with something that might have been delight, "I believe you may have made a rather serious miscalculation." The confidence in Sir Roderick's expression began to waver, and I watched as uncertainty crept into his features. Whatever response he had expected, this was clearly not it, and the Earl's reaction seemed to suggest that his carefully laid trap had somehow become his own snare. "Your lordship," Sir Roderick said uncertainly. "This document," the Earl said, holding up the parchment with obvious satisfaction, "is indeed quite illuminating. Though perhaps not in the way you intended." The Earl set the document down with deliberate care, his expression shifting from amusement to something far more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had just discovered that his patience had reached its absolute limit. "This correspondence," he said, his gaze fixed on Sir Roderick with laser-like intensity, "appears to be a fabrication designed to discredit young Ashford and his family. More troubling still, it bears certain characteristics that suggest it was created by someone with access to official seals and documents, someone who has gravely abused a position of trust." Sir Roderick's face had gone white, and I watched as the full implications of his situation began to dawn on him. Whatever evidence he had thought to present as proof of my unworthiness had apparently backfired spectacularly, revealing instead his own duplicity and corruption. Furthermore, the Earl continued relentlessly, "This document contains information that could only have been obtained through the systematic interception and reading of private correspondence, which constitutes not merely a breach of courtesy but a violation of the Queen's own laws regarding the privacy of noble communications." The room had grown so quiet that I could hear the autumn wind rattling the windows, and I realized that I was witnessing the destruction of a man who had overreached himself in his zeal to prevent my relationship with Cordelia. Sir Roderick had clearly expected his fabricated evidence to end my prospects, but instead it had exposed his own criminal behavior. "Your lordship," Sir Roderick stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, "I can explain." "I'm certain you can," the Earl interrupted smoothly. "However, I believe such explanations would be better offered to Her Majesty's investigators, who will doubtless be interested in understanding how such sophisticated forgeries came to be created using official materials." The finality in his tone made it clear that Sir Roderick's fate was sealed, and as I watched the man who had made my life miserable for weeks crumble before my eyes, I felt not triumph but a strange mixture of relief and pity. His obsession with maintaining social barriers had ultimately led to his own destruction. "As for you, young Ashford," the Earl said, turning to me with an expression that was both grave and approving, "I believe this unfortunate incident has demonstrated both your character and your worthiness more clearly than any formal evaluation could have done. You have conducted yourself with honor throughout this ordeal, refusing to respond to provocation with similar dishonor, and maintaining your dignity even when faced with systematic persecution." Before I could respond, there was another knock at the door, this one accompanied by a familiar voice requesting permission to enter. The Earl called out his consent, and Cordelia stepped into the room, her presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from one of confrontation to something approaching warmth. "Father," she said, offering him a curtsy before her gaze moved to me with obvious concern, "I hope I'm not interrupting matters of importance." "On the contrary," the Earl replied, his stern expression softening as it always did when he looked at his daughter, "your arrival is perfectly timed. Sir Roderick was just leaving, and I believe he will not be troubling us again in the future." Sir Roderick took this dismissal for what it was, bowing stiffly before departing with what remained of his dignity. As the door closed behind him, I felt as though a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. "Now then," the Earl said, settling back into his chair with obvious satisfaction, "I believe we have more pleasant matters to discuss. Cordelia, young Ashford, and I have been having a most illuminating conversation about the future." "Indeed?" she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had some idea of what that conversation might have entailed. "And what conclusions have been reached?" "That some alliances," the Earl said with a meaningful look in my direction, "are worth fighting for, regardless of the obstacles that may stand in their way." He stood and moved to a cabinet near the window, from which he withdrew a small velvet box that he placed on the desk between us. "This ring belonged to my grandmother, a woman who was considered quite unsuitable by the standards of her time but who proved to be one of the strongest and most capable ladies ever to bear our family name." My heart began to race as the implications of his words and actions became clear. He was not simply approving of a courtship, he was offering his blessing for something far more permanent and significant. "Your lordship," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," he said with a smile that held both warmth and steel, that two people who have already demonstrated their willingness to face adversity together might be well suited to face a lifetime of it as husband and wife. I looked at Cordelia, searching her face for any sign of her feelings about this extraordinary development. What I saw there took my breath away, not surprise, but hope, not resignation, but joy, and something deeper that made my pulse quicken and my resolve strengthen. The choice, of course, the Earl continued, must be yours to make. Both of yours. I can offer my blessing and my protection, but I cannot make decisions that will shape the rest of your lives. Cordelia, I said, rising from my chair and moving toward her with hands that trembled slightly despite my efforts to remain composed, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with a joy so pure and complete that it seemed to light up the entire room. Yes, Nathaniel, she said simply, and those two words contained everything I had ever hoped to hear. As I slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, I realized that this moment represented not just the beginning of our life together but the vindication of every risk I had taken and every challenge I had faced. Love had indeed conquered the arbitrary barriers that society had attempted to place between us, but more than that, it had revealed the strength that comes from refusing to compromise one's deepest convictions. The wedding took place 3 months later, in the castle's private chapel with only family and closest friends in attendance. The Earl had insisted that there was no need for elaborate public ceremony, arguing that the most important witnesses to our vows were God and ourselves. As Cordelia walked toward me in a gown of ivory silk that seemed to capture and reflect every ray of the winter sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, I thought that I had never seen anything more beautiful in my entire life. The years that followed proved the Earl's predictions about our partnership to be remarkably prescient. Cordelia's intelligence and education made her an invaluable advisor as I navigated the increasingly complex world of court politics, while her insights into human nature helped me avoid the pitfalls that claimed so many ambitious young men. Together, we built not just a marriage but a true alliance, supporting each other through challenges that would have defeated either of us alone. We were blessed with 3 children, each of whom inherited their mother's quick wit and their father's stubborn determination to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances. As I watched them grow and learned to see the world through their eyes, I came to understand that the most important legacy we could leave them was not wealth or status, but the courage to follow their hearts and the wisdom to choose love over convention. Sir Roderick, as the Earl had predicted, found his influence at court severely diminished after the exposure of his duplicity. He retired to his estates in disgrace, and I never saw him again, though I heard years later that he had become something of a recluse, bitter and alone in his final years. It was a fate that might have befallen anyone who allowed prejudice and fear to override compassion and common sense. Looking back now, from the perspective of a life well lived and a love that has only deepened with time, I can see that the evening when I first danced with Cordelia was the moment when my real life began. Everything that came before was merely preparation, and everything that followed was the fulfillment of possibilities I had never dared to imagine. The lesson I learned, and the one I hope to pass on to anyone who might be listening to this story, is that true love requires not just feeling but courage. It demands that we be willing to stand up for what we believe in, even when the cost seems impossibly high. It asks us to see beyond the surface of things to the deeper truths that connect us all as human beings. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you of the power of love to overcome even the most daunting obstacles, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel for more inspiring tales of romance and courage from history. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that love is always worth fighting for, and remember that sometimes the most beautiful dances are the ones where nothing else matters but the person in your arms and the courage to follow your heart wherever it may lead. In the royal hall, I danced with the king's illegitimate daughter, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. What I discovered was that when we choose love over fear, when we value character over convention, and when we have the courage to defend what truly matters, we don't just find happiness, we create it, and in doing so, we make the world a little more beautiful for everyone who comes after us.